There are periods in life when difficulties compound not through single catastrophic event but through accumulation of minor setbacks that individually seem manageable but that collectively create psychological burden disproportionate to any individual component. When the gap between how you're presenting yourself to the world and how you're actually experiencing your circumstances creates exhausting performance that drains energy faster than the circumstances themselves drain it, when the isolation of managing these difficulties privately while maintaining facade of normalcy to everyone around you becomes more oppressive than the material problems you're trying to solve. Omar Hassan had been living in such a period for approximately 4 months, navigating employment instability and financial pressure and the particular kind of urban loneliness that comes from being surrounded by millions of people while having no one to meaningfully share your struggles with. The notification email had arrived that morning at 6:47 a.m., jolting him awake with the distinctive anxiety that comes from seeing message from service provider in your inbox before you've even gotten out of bed, before you've had coffee or established the psychological defenses that make dealing with institutional communications bearable. Service interruption notice, action required. The email explained that his internet service had been suspended due to outstanding balance, that payment of $127.43 was required to restore service, that failure to resolve this within 72 hours would result in account closure and additional fees for reconnection. Omar sat on the edge of his bed in the small studio apartment he'd been renting for the past 3 years, reading the email on his phone while his laptop, which he needed functioning internet to use for the freelance work that was his only current income source, sat useless on the small desk near the window. The apartment was in an older building in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying slowly, that was caught between its working-class history and its increasingly expensive future, that housed mixture of long-time residents and newcomers priced out of more desirable areas. His unit was on the 4th floor, approximately 420 square feet, with kitchen alcove and bathroom that showed their age despite landlord's minimal maintenance efforts. The rent was $1,340 per month, which was actually reasonable by the city's standards but which represented more than half of Omar's current monthly income and which left minimal buffer for unexpected expenses like the internet service suspension he was now facing. He was 31 years old, had moved to the city 6 years earlier after finishing undergraduate degree at State University, had worked for 4 years as junior analyst at consulting firm before being laid off during company restructuring that had eliminated his entire department. The layoff had occurred 4 months ago, in late June, had come with 2 months of severance pay that had felt generous at the time but that had run out in August, leaving Omar navigating September and October with only the irregular income from freelance data analysis projects he could find through various online platforms and through former colleagues who occasionally had overflow work they could direct his way. The freelance income was unpredictable, some weeks bringing in enough to feel like he was maintaining something resembling stability, other weeks producing almost nothing, averaging perhaps $2,100 per month across the 4 months since his severance had ended. This was enough to cover his rent and minimal food expenses but not enough to absorb the additional costs that kept appearing, the internet bill he'd been deferring because other expenses had felt more urgent, the student loan payment he'd managed to get temporarily suspended but that would resume soon, the health insurance premium that was due in 2 weeks and that would consume nearly a full week's worth of freelance earnings. The financial pressure was substantial but manageable if everything went smoothly, if no unexpected expenses appeared, if the freelance work remained relatively consistent. But nothing was going smoothly. Small problems kept emerging, the coffee maker breaking and requiring replacement, the laptop battery deteriorating and needing to be used primarily plugged in, the prescription medication running out and requiring doctor's appointment and pharmacy visit that together cost $180 even with his diminished insurance coverage. Each individual problem was solvable, was just another expense to absorb or defer, but the accumulation was creating constant stress, constant calculation about what could be delayed and what required immediate attention, constant awareness that he was operating without any buffer against disruption. And now the internet suspension. Which meant he couldn't work on the current freelance project that was due in 3 days and that would pay $650 upon completion. Which meant he'd need to either pay the $127.43 immediately from savings that had dwindled to approximately $340 total, or he'd need to find somewhere else to work, coffee shop with Wi-Fi, library, maybe asking friend if he could use their internet, though that would require explaining his situation in ways he'd been avoiding because admitting the extent of his financial difficulties felt humiliating. Beyond the practical logistics, the suspension felt like symbolic confirmation of how far he'd fallen from where he'd imagined his life would be at 31. When he'd graduated from college and moved to the city, when he'd started the consulting job, when he'd been earning stable salary and building modest savings and feeling like he was establishing himself professionally, he'd imagined that by his early 30s he'd be further along, would have advanced in his career, would be earning more substantial income, would have achieved some measure of financial security that would make these kinds of minor setbacks genuinely minor rather than potentially catastrophic. Instead, he was sitting in his studio apartment at 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, reading service suspension notice about $127 debt, calculating whether he could afford to pay it without creating problems for next month's rent, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety that had become his default emotional state over the past 4 months, feeling exhausted by the constant performance of being fine when anyone asked how he was doing, feeling isolated by having no one to talk to about what he was experiencing because his friends who still had stable employment couldn't really understand the particular stress of financial precarity, and because admitting his difficulties felt like admitting failure. By late evening, approximately 10:30 p.m., after a day spent working at library and growing increasingly frustrated by the limitations of library computers and public Wi-Fi for the kind of technical work he was trying to complete, Omar decided he needed to call customer service. Needed to try to negotiate payment plan or extension or something that would restore his internet access without requiring immediate full payment he couldn't easily afford. He knew the call would probably be frustrating, would probably involve long hold times and scripted responses and eventual refusal of whatever accommodation he was requesting, but he needed to try, needed to exhaust all options before accepting that he'd have to pay the full amount. He dialed the customer service number from his phone. The automated system answered immediately, voice recognition software prompting him to describe his issue. Internet service suspended, he said to the system, his voice flat with exhaustion. The system acknowledged, said it was pulling up his account, said estimated wait time was 12 to 15 minutes, began playing hold music interspersed with recorded messages about account management features and service upgrades he wasn't interested in. Omar put the call on speaker, set his phone on his small kitchen counter, began making tea while waiting. The apartment felt particularly small and shabby this evening. The overhead lighting was harsh fluorescent that made everything look slightly dingy. The walls needed repainting, but that wasn't his responsibility as renter. The view from his single window showed mostly the brick wall of the adjacent building. The city sounds were muted at this hour, occasional distant siren, traffic noise from the avenue 3 blocks away, the building's old radiators beginning their evening routine of clanking and hissing as heat cycled through the system. The hold music continued. Omar moved from kitchen to his bed, sat with his back against the wall, phone beside him continuing to emit tinny music and occasional recorded messages. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. His mind wandered, thought about the project deadline, about whether he could complete it using library Wi-Fi if this call didn't resolve the service suspension, about what he'd do if the freelance income didn't improve, about whether he should just give up on the city and move somewhere cheaper, about whether moving would feel like admitting defeat or like making rational choice about circumstances he couldn't control. The recorded voice interrupted the hold music. This call may be recorded for quality and training purposes. The phrase repeated every few minutes had become so familiar from previous customer service calls that Omar barely registered it anymore. Quality and training. As if these corporate interactions were about quality rather than about minimizing company costs and processing customer issues as efficiently as possible without necessarily resolving them. 17 minutes into the hold, Omar was staring at his apartment's water-stained ceiling, feeling the particular kind of resigned patience that comes from having no choice but to wait, when the hold music cut off and a human voice came through the speaker. "Thank you for holding. My name is Lina. I see you're calling about a service suspension. Can you verify your account number for me, please?" Omar provided the information, heard typing sounds as Lina pulled up his account details. Her voice was distinctive, calm, unhurried, with slight accent he couldn't quite place, with vocal quality that suggested she was genuinely listening rather than just processing information while reading from script. "Okay, I have your account here," Lina said. "I can see the service was suspended this morning due to outstanding balance of $127.43. And I can see you've had several service interruptions over the past few months that don't appear to be related to billing. Can you tell me what's been happening? Omar explained, about the repeated outages that had occurred over the summer, about the service tickets he'd submitted that had sometimes been addressed and sometimes hadn't, about how the unreliable service had been frustrating when he'd been using it for work, about how he'd started prioritizing other bills when the service became less reliable because paying for internet that frequently didn't work felt wasteful. The explanation came out more detailed than he'd intended, was more honest than he'd planned to be with customer service agent he'd never met and would never interact with again. Lina listened without interrupting. When Omar finished, there was brief pause before she spoke again. I understand. That must be really frustrating, especially if you're depending on this for work. Another pause. Then, before we continue with the account details, I want to ask, are you okay today? The question was so unexpected that Omar didn't immediately respond. Customer service agents didn't ask if you were okay. They asked about account numbers and service issues and whether they could help with anything else today. They followed scripts designed to process issues efficiently while maintaining polite professional demeanor. They didn't ask personal questions about your emotional state, didn't deviate from established procedures, didn't treat calls as anything other than transactional interactions to be completed quickly so they could move to next call in their queue. I'm managing, Omar said finally, his voice catching slightly on the word in ways that revealed more than the word itself conveyed. Another silence. But the silence wasn't awkward, wasn't the uncomfortable pause that happens when conversation has stalled and neither party knows how to restart it. It was deliberate space, was Lina allowing what Omar had said to be received rather than immediately moving forward to next item in the call script. I'm going to fix the connection, Lina said after perhaps 5 seconds that felt longer. But I'm also going to remove the late fee. I'm looking at the service history on your account, and you've had 6 separate outages in the past 4 months that weren't resolved properly. That's on us, not on you. You shouldn't be charged late fees when the service you're paying for isn't working reliably. Thank you, Omar managed, feeling unexpected emotion rising in his throat. The late fee removal was approximately $15, not enormous amount, but significant enough given his current financial state, and more importantly was acknowledgement that the service problems weren't his fault, that he wasn't being unreasonable by struggling to pay for service that hadn't been functioning properly. I'm also going to set up a payment plan for the outstanding balance, Lina continued. You can pay it over the next 3 months rather than all at once. Does that help? Yes, Omar said. That helps a lot. He heard typing as Lina made the account adjustments. Then she began asking standard verification questions, confirming his address, his contact information, making sure the service restoration would go to the correct location. But even these routine questions were delivered with different quality than usual customer service interactions. Lina wasn't rushing, wasn't obviously reading from script, was treating the call as conversation with actual person rather than as transaction to be processed. As she worked on the account, small talk emerged organically. Lina mentioned that she was working night shift, that she'd been doing customer service work for 3 years to support her parents while finishing her degree. Omar found himself responding with more honesty than he typically brought to interactions with strangers, mentioned that he'd been laid off, that freelancing was unpredictable, that he was trying to figure out what came next. No one tells you how lonely this part is, Omar said, the words emerging before he'd consciously decided to say them. Like, the practical difficulties are obvious, not having enough money, uncertainty about future, all that. But just, not having anyone to talk to about it. Everyone asking how you're doing and you just say, fine, because explaining the actual situation feels too heavy to put on casual conversation. I know, Lina replied simply. I really do know. But it passes. It always does. Might not feel like it while you're in it, but these difficult periods don't last forever. You find your way through. The connection restoration was completed. The account was updated with payment plan. The technical issue that had prompted the call was resolved. But neither of them moved to end the call, both seemed to recognize that something else was happening beyond the transactional business that justified the interaction. They talked for several more minutes, about the city, about the particular exhaustion of working service jobs, about family obligations and career uncertainty and the strange isolation of urban life where you're surrounded by people but rarely meaningfully connected to any of them. The conversation wasn't dramatic or particularly profound, just two people who happened to be connected through customer service calls sharing small pieces of their experiences, finding brief human connection in context typically characterized by scripted professionalism and efficient transaction processing. Eventually the call had to end. Lina had other customers waiting. Omar needed to let her get back to her work. Before hanging up, Lina said something that would stay with Omar. "You mattered on this call. Even if it didn't feel like it when you dialed. Your situation matters, your struggle matters, you as a person matter. I know that might sound like customer service script, but I mean it. Take care of yourself." The line went dead. Omar sat in his apartment holding his phone, the screen dark, the room silent except for the radiator's continued clanking. Nothing in his material circumstances had changed dramatically. He still had the same financial pressures, still had the same uncertain freelance income, still faced the same challenges that had been oppressing him for months. But something internal had shifted, some weight had lifted slightly, some reminder had been delivered that he wasn't entirely alone in navigating his difficulties, that brief human connection was still possible even in the most transactional and impersonal contexts. Omar slept better that night than he had in weeks. Woke the next morning feeling marginally more capable of facing the day's challenges, feeling slightly less crushed by the accumulated weight of his circumstances. The internet service had been restored as Lina had promised. He verified this immediately upon waking, felt relief at seeing his connection active again, felt gratitude for the payment plan that meant he didn't have to immediately drain what little remained of his savings. He completed the freelance project over the following 2 days, submitted it on schedule, received payment within the week. The money helped, allowed him to pay his rent without immediate panic about next month, allowed him to buy groceries without counting every dollar, allowed him to breathe slightly more easily about his immediate financial situation. But the call with Lina had provided something that money wouldn't have provided, had offered emotional support that was as necessary as financial stability, had reminded him that his struggles weren't character failures but were normal human difficulties that many people navigate and eventually move beyond. He thought about the call frequently over the following weeks. Not obsessively, wasn't romanticizing the interaction or attributing magical properties to brief conversation with customer service agent, but kept returning to how different it had been from typical service interactions. How Lina's willingness to treat him as actual person rather than as ticket to be processed had created space for genuine human connection in context designed to prevent exactly that kind of connection. The city continued around him, millions of people navigating their own struggles and successes, creating the aggregate economic and social activity that defined urban life. The neighborhood where Omar lived showed its characteristic mix, the bodega on the corner where he bought coffee and newspapers, the family restaurant that had been there for 30 years serving the area's Central American population, the new coffee shop with minimalist design that signaled gentrification's continuing advance, the bus stop where workers gathered each morning heading to jobs across the city, the elementary school where children played during recess creating noise that drifted through Omar's window. He'd walk through these streets and would notice people differently than he had before the call with Lina. Would observe the tiredness in other people's faces and would wonder what struggles they were navigating privately while maintaining public facade of normalcy. Would see service workers, the bus drivers, the retail employees, the delivery people, the countless others whose labor kept the city functioning, and would think about Lina working night shifts, would wonder how many of them were supporting families or working multiple jobs or managing difficulties they never discussed with the people they served. The isolation he'd been experiencing didn't disappear, wasn't magically cured by single positive customer service interaction, but it was contextualized differently. He recognized that many people around him were probably experiencing similar isolation, similar gaps between their public presentation and their private reality, similar exhaustion from performing competence and stability while managing precarity and uncertainty. This recognition didn't solve anything material, but it made the experience feel slightly less like personal failure and more like common human situation that social and economic systems created and that individuals navigated as best they could. His freelance work continued to be irregular. Some weeks were financially adequate, others were concerning. The overall pattern was unstable in ways that made planning difficult and that kept anxiety as constant background condition. He applied for full-time positions occasionally, would see job postings that matched his skills, would spend hours crafting applications and updating his resume, would rarely hear back and would almost never advance beyond initial screening when he did hear back. The lack of response was demoralizing but expected. He understood that job markets were difficult, that his employment gap made him less attractive candidate, that hundreds of other qualified people were competing for the same positions. But he maintained. Paid his bills, kept his internet service active through the payment plan Lina had established, continued accepting whatever freelance work he could find, gradually rebuilt his savings back to approximately $800 over the following 3 months. The rebuilding was slow and fragile. Single emergency expense could eliminate what he'd saved, but it was movement in positive direction, was evidence that his situation wasn't in complete freefall. 6 months after the call, Omar found contract position through former colleague, 3-month data analysis project for nonprofit organization, paying hourly rate that was lower than his previous salary had been, but that was reliable and substantial enough to significantly reduce his financial stress. The contract could potentially be extended or could lead to full-time position if his work was strong and if the organization's funding allowed. No guarantees, but possibility, which was more than he'd had for months. He took the position, performed well, found the work more satisfying than he'd expected because the nonprofit's mission aligned with values he cared about in ways his previous corporate consulting work hadn't. The contract was extended twice, eventually converted to full-time position with salary and benefits that weren't generous by consulting industry standards but that were adequate for stable life in the city, that eliminated the constant financial calculation and stress that had characterized his months of freelancing. Throughout this period of gradual stabilization, Omar occasionally thought about calling the customer service line again, about trying to speak with Lina specifically to tell her that her kindness during their call had mattered, that it had provided support during difficult time, that he'd managed to navigate through the difficult period partly because her willingness to treat him as human being rather than as service ticket had reminded him he was human being deserving of care and respect. But he never made that call, partly because he didn't know how to reach Lina specifically through the general customer service number, partly because he worried that articulating his gratitude would make the interaction seem more significant than it had been and would be embarrassing or awkward. So the impact remained private, was just one among countless small kindnesses that people extend to each other daily in cities, small moments of genuine human connection that occur within systems designed to prevent exactly that connection, small resistances to the dehumanization that institutional interactions typically impose. Omar continued living in the city, continued working at the nonprofit, continued maintaining the small apartment that had been home during his most difficult period and that remained home even after his circumstances improved enough that he could have moved somewhere slightly larger or nicer. He stayed partly for practical reasons. Moving was expensive and disruptive, but also because the apartment had become associated with the period of difficulty he'd survived, had become reminder of his own resilience and of the unexpected support he'd received from stranger on customer service call. Lina continued working customer service, continued supporting her parents, eventually completed her degree and moved into different role that allowed her to leave the night shift position. She probably didn't remember the specific call with Omar, handled hundreds of similar calls over the years, couldn't possibly maintain detailed memory of each individual interaction, had developed professional distance necessary to manage the emotional labor of service work without being overwhelmed by accumulated exposure to others' struggles. But the patterns she'd established in that call continued, the willingness to ask if people were okay, the refusal to treat customers as merely tickets to be processed, the recognition that service interactions could include genuine human connection without sacrificing efficiency or professionalism. These patterns created countless small moments similar to what Omar had experienced, created small alleviations of isolation and stress for people navigating their own difficult periods, created cumulative positive impact that was never measured or recognized but that was nonetheless real. The city continued operating as cities do, through aggregation of millions of individual experiences and interactions, through systems both formal and informal that coordinate collective life, through accumulation of small kindnesses and small cruelties that shape daily experience in ways that rarely become visible in official narratives or statistics. The customer service infrastructure continued functioning as designed, processing millions of calls, resolving technical issues, maintaining relationships between service providers and customers that were primarily transactional and that occasionally created space for genuine human connection. And people continued struggling in private while maintaining public facades of competence, continued navigating financial precarity, employment uncertainty, isolation, the various difficulties that urban life creates or exacerbates. Some found support through formal systems, some through informal networks, some through unexpected kindnesses from strangers who happened to be positioned to offer support even if that positioning was as mundane as being the customer service agent who answered a particular call at a particular time. Omar's experience wasn't unique, was probably replicated in some form thousands of times daily in the city, was common pattern rather than exceptional story. But common patterns matter. Common experiences of struggle and support and gradual stabilization are how most people actually navigate their lives, are the substance of existence even if they rarely become narratives worth telling or recognizing. The apartment's radiators continued their nightly routine of clanking and hissing. The neighborhood continued its slow transformation between working-class history and gentrified future. The bodega on the corner continued selling coffee and newspapers. The bus stop continued hosting morning gatherings of workers heading to jobs across the city. The elementary school children continued their recess play. The city continued being city, vast, indifferent, occasionally brutal, occasionally kind, always too complex to be reduced to simple narratives about opportunity or difficulty. And Omar continued working, continued living, continued maintaining the stability he'd fought to achieve, continued being one among millions navigating the particular challenges and possibilities that urban life creates. Remembered the call with Lina not as transformative moment that changed everything but as small instance of unexpected support that had arrived when he'd needed it, that had reminded him he wasn't entirely alone, that had helped him maintain enough hope and dignity to continue through difficult period until circumstances eventually improved. The memory wasn't dramatic. Didn't involve revelation or profound insight. Was just reminder that kindness exists, that human connection is possible even in contexts designed to prevent it, that people struggling alone are sometimes not alone, that support appears in unexpected forms through unexpected channels at unexpected times. Sometimes kindness arrives disguised as routine voice on the other end of the line. Sometimes the support you need comes from stranger whose job is just to process your service ticket efficiently and move to the next call. Sometimes what makes the difference isn't dramatic intervention but just someone willing to acknowledge that you're struggling, to treat you as person rather than as account number, to extend basic human care in context that typically demands impersonal professionalism. This isn't meant to romanticize service work or to suggest that customer service agents should be providing emotional support beyond their job requirements. Lina was working, was doing her job, was following company procedures even as she made space within those procedures for genuine human interaction. The point isn't that service workers should carry additional emotional labor beyond their already demanding work, isn't that every customer service call should become therapy session, isn't that institutional interactions should replace formal support systems. The point is that small moments of genuine human connection matter, that brief acknowledgements of each other's humanity create impacts that extend beyond the immediate interaction, that systems designed for efficiency and transaction processing can still include space for care and empathy if individuals choose to create that space. Lina chose to ask if Omar was okay. That choice didn't require violating her professional responsibilities, didn't require sacrificing efficiency, didn't require anything beyond brief willingness to recognize that person on other end of call was person experiencing difficulties rather than just service issue to be resolved. And that brief recognition mattered to Omar. Didn't solve his financial problems, didn't find him employment, didn't change his material circumstances in any direct way. Just reminded him that he was human being deserving of care, that his struggles were legitimate and recognized, that he wasn't entirely alone in navigating his difficulties. That reminder sustained him through the remaining difficult weeks until his circumstances improved, gave him emotional resources to continue when continuing felt impossible, created small foundation of dignity and hope that supported his eventual stabilization. So notice the people you interact with, even in the most transactional contexts, even when you're tired and busy, even when institutional systems encourage impersonal efficiency. Notice when someone is struggling, when routine interaction is actually difficult for them, when brief acknowledgement might provide support they need. You won't always know when your kindness matters, won't receive feedback about impacts you create, won't be recognized or rewarded for extending basic human care in contexts that don't formally require it. But the kindness matters anyway. Creates effects that ripple forward in ways you'll never see. Provides support to people navigating difficulties you'll never fully understand. Maintains possibility of human connection in systems designed to prevent it. Reminds both giver and receiver that we're not entirely alone, that care still exists, that small gestures of recognition and support create cumulative positive impact even when that impact is never measured or celebrated. Listen closely. Sometimes kindness arrives disguised as routine voice on the other end of the line. Be StoryWise.